Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of Future Cities. I'm Steve Nelser. In 2020, issues of systemic racism and racial justice rightfully rose to the forefront of many people's minds. These issues are relevant in all aspects of society, including academia and STEM fields. In solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and inspired by other efforts that we've seen on social media to elevate Black voices in STEM, we wanted to use our platform on this podcast to amplify the voices of Black scientists working in the field of urban resilience. So, for Black History Month, February, we will be publishing one episode every week featuring a conversation with a different Black scientist in our field. We've never published so many episodes in such a short period of time and plan to go back to just publishing 1 or 2 episodes a month after this, but our team felt that this was important and were willing to put in the extra work to get these conversations to you. So, big thanks to Yoan Kim, Robert Lloyd, and Marissa Matsler for taking the lead on these special episodes. This week's episode is the third installment of our Black History Month series, so please go back and listen to the previous 2 episodes if you happen to have missed them. Without further ado, here's this week's episode. I hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Stephen. And hello, everyone. I'm Marissa Matsler, a sometimes podcaster here with Future Cities, and I'm honored that I was able to participate as a producer for this special series of podcasts for Black History Month. I think it's really important for us to all share our positionality as researchers. So I wanted to begin by acknowledging the privilege that I experience in the academy as a white scientist, and that I take seriously my obligation to make space for my colleagues of color. Not that I'm always getting it right, but as my guest discusses today, we all need to be walking the talk. So not just saying Black Lives Matter when we're out protesting, but showing that Black Lives Matter in our daily actions. So as a white person, this means to me, among other things, not allowing myself to become complacent in the comfort of my own privilege. And while this podcast series is a small gesture, I'm happy to see Future Cities using their platform to support this walking of the talk. So today I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Marccus Hendricks about his research and his trajectory as an academic. Dr. Hendricks is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. So as an urban planning scholar, his research is inherently interdisciplinary. He's looking at intersections of stormwater infrastructure, social vulnerability, hazard mitigation, among many other things. Now, if you've heard any of my past Future Cities podcasts, you'll now know why I'm so excited to be talking with Dr. Hendricks today. We share many of the same research interests. And though Dr. Hendricks is technically still an early career researcher, he's already accomplished quite a lot, receiving multiple awards and establishing a very cool research program at University of Maryland. He has a recently funded project, and the title, I think, gives you a really good idea of his research in general. It is titled Infrastructure, Urban Flooding, and its Influence on Social Vulnerability and Mobility, a place-based study in Southeast Washington, D.C. So I'm very appreciative of the time that Dr. Hendricks has spent with me today, and I'm excited to share our conversation about his work, as well as his visions for the future with you all. I hope you enjoy. Well, hello, everyone. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Hendricks to the Future Cities podcast. We'll be talking with him today. Welcome, Dr. Hendricks.
Hi, Marissa. Thanks for having me.
To start us off today, I'd like to talk a little bit more about your lab at University of Maryland. You're the director of the Stormwater Infrastructure, Resilience, and Justice Lab. And I'm hoping you tell us a little bit more about your own trajectory as a researcher. What led you to start this lab, and what kind of impact do you hope it will have?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I think for anybody that has followed me and my work over the years probably has heard this story in some version or another, but it's really a matter of lived experience for me. I grew up in a low-income Black and Latinx community in inner city Dallas, an area where poor communities were overburdened with toxic and waste treatment facilities, or Black neighborhoods had more liquor and tobacco stores than they did healthy food outlets and grocery markets, or where female-headed households and multifamily housing stock were surrounded by bad streets and it flooded all the time. And that was my lived experience. And I was raised by a single mother, and we lived in what most scholars would consider an environmental justice community, where our house and our home was flooded on multiple occasions. And the street that I grew up on specifically was a street by the name of Stanley Smith Drive, and the street perpendicular to mine's was a street by the name of Prosperity Avenue. The irony about that is that there was nothing becoming about the built environment that was set aside for us and the folks that live there. In fact, I would notice that the drainage and ditches in my neighborhood looked distressed and were visually, filled with litter, trash, and debris. And when I would travel across town to other neighborhoods, there was a stark difference in the quality and appearance of of their ditches and drains relative to ours. And from that point on, I began to question, what was it about my neighborhood that created these circumstances and built environments, not only for my community, but other similar communities. And that fundamental intuition is sort of what has led me here today and shaped my current research agenda, including my research lab at the University of Maryland. And so when it comes to, the Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab at the University of Maryland, we take a social lens to what has largely been studied as a physical process. We focus on how infrastructure, environmental outcomes, and neighborhood forces interact to affect people's everyday lives and their lives during extreme events. The lab studies everyday urban stormwater management and extreme events such as urban flooding. And we investigate the socio-spatial dynamics related to the inventory, condition, and distribution of critical systems and public works, mainly water infrastructure in terms of stormwater, wastewater, and drinking water, and green space. We use a number of, theoretical frameworks between environmental justice and social vulnerability to disaster, as well as some more fundamental sociological theories, to really explore, the ways in which, human-built environments set the stage for risk and disaster for particular communities that have been marginalized along the lines of race, ethnicity, class, nationality, and specifically, from everyday rainfall and storm events and how those things build and escalate to overwhelm systems, especially in the era of faster, more frequent and intense stormwater runoff. And my hope is that within our lab and within this work, we bridge the gap between, issues of infrastructure design and installation that has largely been led by engineers and engineering, and and the social issues that surround infrastructure maintenance, rehabilitation, and management over the life cycle of some of these assets, and really sort of make the case that built systems, albeit physical or not, operate in a social world. And these built systems are subjected to the same social constructs and ideologies that everything else within a social world is subjected to. And we have to sort of see these built features as a continuation of social circumstances if we really want to address issues of disparity, vulnerability, and injustice.
Excellent. Yes, I think it's so interesting to look at infrastructure through that social lens. Bringing in different pieces. Yeah, I think that's required. To make infrastructure more resilient, to make it sustainable, to make it actually serve communities. One of my questions in this area and how your lab works, I myself work on a lot of interdisciplinary projects, and I think that's why I like your work so much, because you are bringing in all these different disciplinary views with that social lens. And I find that a lot of these projects really necessitate mixed methods approaches, thinking about the research side in particular. And sometimes I feel like the methods that I need don't even exist yet. I'm kind of like putting together things in new ways. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your methods, the mixed methods that you might use in your research, or how you've combined methods to address these complicated problems that you're looking at.
Sure, absolutely. Marissa, I think these grand environmental challenges that we face, whether we're talking climate change, the infrastructure crisis, the current, global COVID-19 pandemic, these are huge problems that fundamentally require sort of an interdisciplinary approach to fully and completely and effectively address these crises. And I was trained as an interdisciplinary scholar. I didn't have sort of a linear pathway to my terminal degree, which is in urban and regional science. And so, from the very beginning, I understood sort of the importance of having, multiple perspectives scientifically and academically in order to be able to address some of these grand challenges. I was trained in my master's work in public health. And in my time in public health, I noticed that, in some ways, the issues that we were attempting to intervene on could have and should have been addressed from the very beginning through the design of communities. And that sort of experience led me to pursuing a PhD in urban and regional science to get after some of those root causes to mitigate, having to intervene altogether. And I think, mixed method scholarship is very similar to the interdisciplinary nature of, that's needed for some of these grand challenges, because I don't think that we can, fully understand and answer questions purely through a qualitative and or quantitative approach. I think it requires both. And I think that those, multiple, approaches through methods and design complement each other and help to refine the design and, approaches to the research. And I also think too, we tend to be siloed. We tend to be very polarizing in terms of what we, advocate for and the approaches that we use across disciplines based off of our training. And really the goal ought to be some triangulation of that. Even if in computer science, we're developing new codes and technologies to use big data and understand phenomena, I think that that data and those approaches should be triangulated with more, qualitative approaches to understand how bias may be built into, algorithms or built into information technology. But then also too, bringing in communities to also be able to interpret and fully understand what we think we know through these secondary means of data analysis and collection. And in my work, I've sort of demonstrated the ways in which we can sort of engage communities and activate them as community scientists to be able to contribute to both quantitative and qualitative research, to be able to provide, grounded understanding and to provide truth to what we think we know and what we're finding in these alternative methods. And again, I think very similar to sort of interdisciplinary scholarship, mixed methods research is absolutely critical. The triangulation of data is absolutely critical if, again, we want to fully understand these huge phenomena that we face now and into the future.
Yeah, so you mentioned working with communities, and that's something that I'm constantly I'm striving to do in my own work, I should say. I've been trying to find ways to better incorporate community data and citizen science and lived experience on the ground. Which, as you talked about at the beginning, sharing your story, it's so lived experience is so important to designing communities. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about engaging with communities. Maybe advice you would have for other scholars who are trying to get into that line of research?
Sure, yeah. When it comes to the community engagement, participation, community science dimensions of my research, it was really born out of my early work that I did in, inner city Houston during my time as a doctoral student. And, a lot of folks think based off of my current publications that my dissertation was really centered around the community science work, when in fact, what happened was that my dissertation is largely using secondary data and doing quantitative spatial analysis of the distribution of infrastructure systems. And I sort of use that work as a primer to give communities something to respond to in terms of, does this sound right? Is this something that you sort of can verify in terms of what you know of your systems and the distribution of these systems? And I use that experience to then say, wait a minute, more needs to be done and or said about these secondary analyses. And I also wanted to sort of leave something meaningful behind for the communities that I was engaging and I was working with. And so the community science work that I began after that really is an extension of my dissertation research. And again, sort of, a way that I was able to put boots on the ground and do some confirmation of what I think I was seeing in the secondary data analyses. But then to be able to share capacity between myself and the research that I had been doing, and to learn from community members in terms of their intuitions and lived experience, to be able to refine my understanding of the total problem. Essentially, what I was able to do, I was able to adopt an approach and a technique that is used by engineers to do visual inspections of infrastructure, and I was able to adapt it for community use, and then working with a group of community students, their teachers, and family, to actually go out in the field and do visual inspection of their community infrastructure. We were also able to validate and verify the technique by setting up an experiment, comparing the data that the community scientists were collecting to that of trained engineers and LiDAR technology. And we were able to statistically demonstrate that there wasn't a statistically significant difference in the quality of data, between these three different data collection techniques and processes. And that's important, right? Because we talk about a number of burdens as it relates to environmental justice. And one of those hidden burdens is the burden of proof, of validation, of reliability, of being able to demonstrate, in fact, that the intuition that these communities have from lived experiences is actually can be systematically derived through validated methods, tools, and techniques. And so yeah, and I think that work build a built a larger momentum that got community members engaged and involved to then be able to advocate on their own behalf in terms of the capital improvements and investments that needed to be made. And not only did they have sort of the use of my secondary data analysis to provide context, but then they had further proof from their data collection to then be able to advocate, and just a sort of a vetted technique to utilize into the future, and to scale up in being able to fill data gaps about their experience, and to potentially support municipalities that have real data gaps in terms of the quality and condition of their existing systems and infrastructure.
That is very cool. Yeah, I think it's a really big opportunity, yeah, to learn about lived experiences, but also to have that back and forth with the municipality.
Again, going back to the importance of mixed method scholarship, going through iterations of, quantitative, qualitative community work, and community science, and allowing those things to refine and build each other, give us an opportunity to understand these issues in ways that we never understood them before, and to be able to refine these methods and approaches for the better. And again, through a much more cumulative approach to doing really robust and engaged scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like there's a big opportunity even to work with the planning process. I'm thinking also, I'm also a planning scholar, and I think about going to planning meetings, and where it feels like there's sometimes this huge mismatch between what the city department is presenting to folks at a public meeting and what kind of responses they get, where it's and so trying to find those points where people can actually connect, and provide data where it's useful on both sides. I think the planning process suffers from community thinking like, why, oh, they don't care what I think, and the city being like, they're not giving me information on the thing that I need information on. I'm not sure if you can comment about that mismatch, if you've seen things like that in the past, and if you've been able to make connections, or how have you been able to make connections in the past?
Yeah, I think there's a missed opportunity in engaging communities in terms of just bettering our work, whether it's planning practice or planning scholarship. And fundamentally, as a planning scholar, our job is to act as a liaison between stakeholders and elected leadership and governing bodies and the community. And if we're not building those relationships and consistently engaging communities from the very beginning and actively providing agency, power, and space for them to have meaningful contribution, we're doing a disservice to the discipline. We're doing a disservice to the practice, the research, and most of all, the community. I've seen these types of circumstances play out. I think we still have a long way to go in terms of ethically, meaningfully, and consistently engaging communities, and being clear that the community should have the last say so in terms of what's being done, and that we're partnering with communities, and that we're going into a meaningful, one of my major professors, particularly for the community engagement training that I received at Texas A&M, Dr. John Cooper, would always say it's important for us to have a covenant with communities, to where from the onset of engagement, we all understand the nature of the relationship, and that we sort of manifest those, what we want to see through the engagement process and through our ongoing interactions. And I think that's important. Unfortunately, when it comes to community engagement, specifically from, the research side and the academic side, is that, we've done very superficial community engagement. We have a legacy and history of doing helicopter research, where we drop down, extract, and then we exit. And I think some of the communities that I worked with early on in my career were hip to the ways in which they've been exploited by academic institutions. And it was interesting because they held my feet to the fire in ensuring that I wouldn't do to them the same things that have been done historically, right? And so as a doctoral student, early on in engaging with these communities, the first year or so was really the community vetting me to ensure that I had their best intentions in mind, best interest in mind, and asking me to sort of sit on panels so that way they can see sort of the perspective and hear the perspective that I was coming from. and asking for support on broader community issues that weren't necessarily in line with the focus of my dissertation research, helping to support, through doing pro bono work for grant development and grant writing. And and most of all, relationship building with these communities, and then once they were able to vet and see, okay, this guy's really interested in us as a community and willing to put in the work to support us in the ways that we see fit. Now we're willing to provide him entree into our community and the broader community and work with him in support of not only our ongoing and pre-existing goals, but also the interest and goals that he brings to the table and he would like to explore. And that type of relationship building and vetting is critical and important work. And I think if it's done right the first time and it's nurtured, throughout, the life of planning with communities and for communities, then, we don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel or start from scratch every single time that a new issue arises. And that's just not how it should be done. And I think, even when it comes to, the current COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges that we're seeing in terms of access to the vaccine and distribution of public health infrastructure, a lot of these things could have been worked through had we been engaging with communities and having an understanding of access and ability and thoughts and culture around a number of issues, and it would have provided us a pathway to more quickly address and get after some of the challenges that we're facing in light of these issues. But I think that there's promise, there's an opportunity, if in fact, we sort of tap into that opportunity and engage communities early and often.
Yeah, I really like that idea of the trust building and the covenant with the community. Like I think that's an excellent way to frame it. Yeah. Yeah. That was also making me think of the social contract in general. This idea that that our government, we're going to be working with the government, communities are working with the government, that there's a give and take there, and that's making me think of the ways that that social contract has really been stressed by this last year in new ways and a lot of old ways that are coming back around. And so for the question of the year here for you, how has your work changed through all of the upheaval of 2020? The COVID epidemic, we have a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. This is like a resurgence of these high profile racial justice uprisings. We have the election season. There was a lot of things that happened in 2020. So just kind of reflecting on how your research, if at all, was kind of 2020'd.
Sure. Yeah. I think, this year has really, in a way like never before, illuminated things that we, folks who study disaster and environmental justice have known for a long time, that disasters are really just the moment when these underlying vulnerabilities and injustices are exploited and put on full and front and center, and I think what we've seen in 2020 was just that. And I think that once we started to unpack the infection and transmission data along the lines of race, ethnicity, and class, again, for anybody who studies vulnerability on environmental justice, wouldn't have been surprised, because the same folks who are on the front lines of transmission or living in multi-generational households are also the same communities that lack access to green space or lack access to healthy food outlets, or that have infrastructure that is in disrepair, or that are overburdened by a number of other sort of environmental related issues. And so really, it's race and inequality on repeat, and it's pervasive and transects, a number of hazard events, whether it's climate, the broader environment or public health. And I think for me, it was, it was a moment to sort of explore the convergence of all of these issues through the work that I've already done. And, I did a lot of, media and more public writing this past year to really sort of get my thoughts on paper and to really, contribute to the public discourse in this moment. And I'm glad that I did it, because it was quite cathartic for me through, one of my essays, particularly that I wrote for the Social Science Research Council. And it was, it was entitled Transforming Public Safety and Urban Infrastructure to Mitigate Climate and Public Health Disasters. And in that piece, I talk about, how in light of past transgressions and ongoing disparities between the pandemic and police brutality, the global reckoning has been illuminated, and there's an opportunity to rethink public safety and fundamentally rehabilitate urban infrastructure and reconstruct local democracy that has also been under attack. And has continued to be under attack as we moved into 2021. And so, I think for me, sort of sharing with the world this understanding that, civic and citizen participation is a progressively important pillar in planning and beyond, and it's sort of this democratic gateway to building a more just, inclusive, and resilient world. And I think through the use of, a lot of the work that I've done over the years provides a pathway to where we can, provide that participation, accountability, and the transparency that the people are demanding in our democracy, and trying to hold our democracy accountable in terms of what we say or think we are in these United States of America. And so, again, I think, it wasn't, new to my work or new for me in terms of these issues. Is really just, a different hazard, but the same fundamental issues that are driving inequality, disparity, and trauma in marginalized communities.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I think it's always interesting to hear the surprise in some commentary, like, oh my gosh, how can this be happening? And you're saying, hey, we've been looking at this for a long time. So it's that opportunity to really have these ideas be at the forefront of how we're moving forward.
And what I appreciated about this moment is, I think because we do have decades of corroborated evidence between folks who study social vulnerability and those who study environmental justice, that now we've sort of reduced injustice and vulnerability to, to individual variables, and demographics, without talking about the larger issues. And so when we talk about folks, are more vulnerable based off their race, ethnicity, and class, it's not because they're inherently vulnerable. It's because issues of racism, classism, sexism. And I think that, this moment provided space and an opportunity to be clear and explicit about that, and to revisit, how we, arrived at these demographic variables to begin with. And these are, issues of not race, but racism, not class, but classism, not, gender, but sexism. And I think that's been really important for me, and I think just this moment in general.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, switching that focus. It's not these inherent qualities that, yes, I think there's a lot of hope, I think, moving forward, if we can really keep that front and center. I'd like us to reflect a little bit on the future. So our podcast is focused on the future of cities, and so we're curious to hear a little bit from you. How do you see some of this playing out into the future? We often put the time frame out at 2080 when we're talking with stakeholders, to kind of put it in like somewhat near term, so not like, hundreds of years in the future, but sort of like the near term far future. So how would you like to see your own city change by 2080?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think ultimately what I would like to see, is my city as well as other cities across the country, a space where, or spaces where Black, Brown, and Indigenous and lower income folks have a right to the city, and policies that actively create safe spaces for them. And I think, just transitions, both in terms of climate resilience and adaptation, but also in this second wave of urbanization or reurbanization. And something that, came to mind for me this summer, as I participated in demonstrations for, Black Lives Matter in Washington, D.C., was that, you know, we had some of the most diverse set of protests and demonstrations that we've seen, in decades, if not ever. However, the challenge is that, when it comes to cities and communities, we lack sort of the continuity between, demonstrations and what we say we believe, and what we actually do in our individual and personal lives. And so, as much as I was hopeful to see a critical mass of young professional white folks, and folks, non-Black folks participating in some of these Black Lives Matter demonstrations, was that after the demonstration was over, these white individuals had the opportunity to just continue walking to their communities in Washington, D.C., communities where, that have gentrified and pushed Black folks out, communities that were historically Black communities that are no longer Black communities. And so, when it comes to what I would hope to see, is that there is some continuity between what we do and say in the streets, in terms of protests and demonstrations, but then also how we live our daily lives and what we advocate for. Because, a better future depends on that continuity, to say that, it's not just good enough, to say that Black Lives Matter, but to also demonstrate and show it through individual choices and decisions, from a household to a community. That's what I hope to see. And I hope to see, communities that are provided with an abundance of support as opposed to being over policed. Communities that, create, and invest in infrastructure, as opposed to systems that are crumbling beneath their feet. Cities that provide access to homes, and where people actually work, to sort of eradicate this spatial mismatch between, where people live and work. And communities that are walkable, bikeable, that have access to public transportation, and all of these other things that we laud as sort of a more resilient and sustainable way forward. But again, for those things to fundamentally be grounded in an environmental justice framework, and a social and racial justice framework, because and lead with those things. Because again, if we don't address, these these root causes and fundamental drivers, then we don't stand a chance at sort of a more just, and ultimately we can't be sustainable and resilient if we're not addressing issues of inequity and inequality. And so, I think that's what I can, that's what I hope for, and that's what I would like to see, by 2080, if we're ever so lucky.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point as well about the systemic nature of these issues. Like for example, like systemic racism. I think one of the one of the issues with that is this idea that it's over there, that it's like it's the system, and it's sort of you can pretend like you're not a part of that. And I think what you said there too about this idea that all of our individual actions are what is making up this system. Like we're making the system. It's people. It's a social system. And so I try to keep in the front of my mind, and also in sharing with other people, saying, this is like this, it's what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's who we are, that we are making up the system. We can change this system. It's a social system. Like you said, it's not some kind of inherent natural law that we somehow are just unable to follow. We just have to follow along, or unable to change. So I think
Sure.
that's something that I'm trying to keep. I hope to keep front and center in all of this, so it doesn't fall away again. Again, like there are these moments, right? It's nothing new, but it's these moments where it comes into the forefront, and how can we keep it centered?
Sure. And I think, we can't genuinely say that Black Lives Matter if we limit it to just police brutality. And we just say, Black Lives Matter when it comes to police brutality, but then we go back to our communities and participate in NIMBY groups that push back on the siting of affordable housing, or we push back, on apartment complexes in terms of the percentage or amount of affordable units that are made available to moderate to low income individuals. We can't say that Black Lives Matter and say it genuinely if in fact they don't matter, not only when it comes to police brutality, but also income equality, housing affordability, and a number of sort of more latent, invisible issues that we live by every single day.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so important to look at all the different pieces, and there's that planner coming out there. You're bringing the planning together. It's all connected. We have to do it on all these fronts. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So for my last question, I personally think that your research is very inspiring, and I'm imagining that others have been inspired by what you've said here today. And so, what advice do you have for people who would like to go into the similar field, or to follow in your footsteps?
Sure. I would probably say, one, to not be discouraged by a pathway that seemingly doesn't make sense at the moment or at any given moment, because I think at the end of the day, things converge in a manner and come together for the benefit and provide you over time with tools on your utility belt that will lend you a perspective, and lend you skill sets that will be useful, even though they didn't necessarily line up in a more traditional sense as you move through and across disciplines or degrees or pathways. And then I think, ultimately I would say to be visionary and imaginative, to think bold, but then act bolder, and to hold on to good principle from the classroom, through practice, through research, and to value communities and community offerings, and understand that, as a planner, specifically, our job is made that much more easier if we actually do what we're supposed to be doing in terms of listening to communities, partnering with communities, allowing communities to hold space and power and agency in decision making, and because again, sort of they have the intuition about the built, the social, the political, the economic, and feasibility nature of the issues, the very issues that we're supposed to be supporting them with. And if in fact we provide, a seat at the table, for communities, then again, I think it makes for a much easier process to actually meaningfully and effectively address these issues. And again, I think that in this moment, it's in the spirit of our democracy. Those are the types of things that we ought to be doing. And I think sometimes as planners, planning students learn things in the classroom, but then they have to abandon those principles in practice because, of the bureaucratic nature of, municipal governance. But what better time than this to hold on to those good principles, to hold on to those visions and that imagination, because that's ultimately what's going to be required in order for us to realize a different city by 2080. And so, I think that, planning, is a discipline with a world of possibilities. It's interdisciplinary, by nature, and it allows you to sort of have an impact in ways, both short term and longer term, that a lot of other disciplines don't allow for. And it's sort of the collision of these titans of the public and the private, the social and the physical, as well as the critical thought and more rational thinking with the creativity. And I think if planners embrace everything that we have to offer, and leverage sort of those intersections, then I think it makes for an incredible and meaningful career.
Thank you so much for those words. I think that's a great way to wrap things up here this afternoon. Thank you again. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Marissa, for having me. And I appreciate it and enjoyed my time with you. Thanks.
The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.